Hi there, and welcome back to our daily reading of the Oz books. We will be reading two more chapters today from the Royal Book of Oz by Ruth Plumley Thompson. Yesterday's reading, we had Dorothy and the Cowardly Lion in the Kingdom of Pokes, and they met Sir Hokus, and he helped them escape the sleepy kingdom of the Pokes as they all ran away, singing to keep the Pokes away. So we're going to pick up our story today following the adventures of the Scarecrow underground. So this is Chapter 7. The Scarecrow is hailed as Emperor. Leaning forward on the great throne, the Scarecrow waited impatiently for the ancient gentleman to speak. The gray-skinned courtiers were eyeing him expectantly, and just as the suspense became almost unbearable, the old man threw up his arms and cried sharply, "The prophecy of the magic beanstalk has been fulfilled. In this radiant and sublime Scarecrowicus, the spirit of Chang Wang Wo, the mighty, has returned, and I, the grand Choo-Choo of the realm, prostrate myself before this wonderful Scarecrowicus, Emperor of the Silver Islands." So likewise did all the company present, and the Scarecrow, taken unawares, flew up several feet and landed in a heap on the steps leading to the throne. He climbed back hurriedly, picking up the fan and parasol that he had plucked from the beanstalk. "I wish Professor Wogglebug could hear this," said the Scarecrow, settling himself complacently. "But I must watch out and remember to hold on." The Grand Choo-Choo was the first to rise, and folding his arms, he asked solemnly, "What are your commands, ancient and honorable Scarecrowcus?" "If you'd just omit the cuss," begged the Scarecrow in an embarrassed voice, I think I could think better." "Am I in China, or where? Are you Chinamen, or what?" "We are Silvermen," said the Grand Choo-Choo impressively, "and a much older race than our Chinese cousins. They are people of the sun. We are people of the stars. Has your Highness so soon forgotten?" "I am afraid," said the Scarecrow, rubbing his chin reflectively, "that I have." He gazed slowly around the great throne room. Ozma's palace itself was not more dazzling. The floor of the dull silver blocks was covered with rich blue rugs. Furniture, chairs, screens, and everything were made of silver, inlaid with precious stones. Filigreed silver lanterns hung from the high ceilings, and tall silver vases, filled with pink and blue blossoms, filled the rooms with their perfume. Blue flags embroidered with silver stars fluttered from the walls and the tips of the pike-bearers' spears, and silver seemed to be so plentiful that even shoes were fashioned of it. Faintly, through the windows, came the sweet tones of 100 silver chimes, and altogether the Scarecrow was quite dazed by his apparent good fortune. Surely they had called him Emperor, but how could that be? He turned to address the Grand Choo-Choo. Then, as he saw out of the corner of his eye that the assemblage were making ready to fall upon their faces, he exclaimed in a hoarse whisper, "May I speak to you alone?" The Grand Choo-Choo waved his hand imperiously, and the courtiers, with a great crackling of silver brocade, backed away from the hall. "Very kind of them to bow, but I wish they wouldn't," sighed the Scarecrow, sinking back on the throne. "It blows one about so. I declare, if another person falls at my feet, I'll have a nervous prostration." Again he took a long survey of the hall, then turned to the Grand Choo-Choo. "Would you mind," he asked simply, "telling me again who I am and how?" "Who and how? Who you are, illustrious sir, the Emperor Chang Wang Wo, or to be more exact, his spirit." "I have always been a spirited person," observed the Scarecrow dubiously, "but never a spirit without a person. I must insist on being a person." "How? the Grand Choo-Choo proceeded, without noticing the Scarecrow's remarks. 50 years ago, after your extreme highness had defeated in the battle the king of the Golden Islands, a magician entered the realm. This magician, in the employ of this wicked king, entered a room in the palace where your highness lay sleeping, and by an act of necromancy changed you to a crocus. Ouch! Exclaimed the Scarecrow, shuddering involuntarily. And had it not been for the Empress, your faithful wife, you would have been lost forever to the Empire. Wife? Gasped the Scarecrow faintly. Have I a wife? If your highness will permit me to finish, begged the Grand Choo-Choo, with great dignity. The Scarecrow nodded. Your wife, Sing Sing, the beautiful, took the crocus, which was fading rapidly, and planted it in a silver bowl in the center of this very hall, and for 3 days kept it fresh with her tears. Waking on the 3rd morning, the Empress was amazed to see in the place of the crocus a giant beanpole that extended to the roof of the palace and disappeared among the clouds. Ah, murmured the Scarecrow, looking up, my family tree. Beside the beanpole lay a crumpled parchment. The Grand Choo-Choo felt in the sleeve of his kimono and brought out a bit of crumpled silver paper, and adjusting his horn spectacles, read slowly. Into the first being who touches this magic pole on the other side of the world, the spirit of Emperor Chang Wang Wo will enter, and 50 years from this day he will return to save his people. The Grand Choo-Choo took off his specs and folded the paper. The day has come. You have come down the beanpole and are undoubtedly that being who has gone from Emperor to Crocus to Scarecrocus. I have ruled these islands 50 years. Have I seen to the education of your sons and grandsons, and now, gracious and exalted master, as I am an old man, I ask you to relieve me from the cares of state. Sons? Grandsons? Choked the Scarecrow, beginning to feel very much alarmed indeed. How old am I? Your Highness, said the Grand Choo-Choo, with a deep salaam, is as old as I. In other words, you are in the ripe and glorious 85th year of your Majesty's illustrious and useful age. 85? Gasped the Scarecrow, staring in dismay at the gray, wrinkled face of the old Silverman. Now see here, Choo-Choo, are you sure of that? Quite sure, immortal and honored master. The Scarecrow could not help but be convinced of the truth of the Grand Choo-Choo's story. The pole in the Munchkin farmer's cornfield was none other than the magic beanstalk, and he, thrust on the pole by the farmer to scare away the crows, had received the spirit of the Emperor Chang Wang Wo. Which accounts for my cleverness, he thought gloomily. Now surely he should have been pleased, for he had come in search of a family. But the acquisition of an empire, sons and grandsons, and old age, all in a trice, fairly took his breath away. Does the prophecy say anything about restoring my imperial person? He asked anxiously, for the thought of looking like Choo-Choo was not a cheerful one. Alas, no, sighed the Grand Choo-Choo sorrowfully. But we have very clever wizards on the island, and I shall set them to work at once on this problem. Now, don't be in such a rush, begged the Scarecrow, secretly determined to lock up the wizards at the first opportunity. I'm rather fond of this shape. You see, it requires no food and never tires or grows old. The royal robes will in a measure conceal it, murmured the Grand Choo-Choo politely, and clapped his hands. A little servitor bounced into the hall. A royal robe, Quicksilver, for his radiant highness, snapped the Grand Choo-Choo. In a moment, Quicksilver had returned with a magnificent purple satin robe, embroidered in silver threads and heavy with jewels, and a hat of silver cloth with upturned brim. The Scarecrow wrapped himself in the purple robe, took off his old Munchkin hat, and substituted the imperial headpiece. "How do I look, Chew?" he asked anxiously. "Quite like your old imperial self, except—" The old Prime Minister ran unsteadily out of the room. There was a muffled scream from the hall, and the next instant he returned with a long, shiny silver queue, which he had evidently clipped from the head of one of the servants. Removing the Scarecrow's hat, he pinned the queue back to the back, set it on the Scarecrow's head, and stood regarding him with great satisfaction. "Ah, if the Empress could only see you," he murmured rapturously. Where is she?" asked the Scarecrow, looking around nervously. His long, carefree life in Oz had somewhat unfitted him, he reflected, for family life. "Alas," sighed the Grand Choo-Choo, wiping his eyes on the sleeve of his kimono, "she has returned to her silver ancestors." "Then show me her picture," commanded the Scarecrow, visibly affected. The Grand Choo-Choo stepped to a side wall, and pulling a silken cord, disclosed the picture of a large gray lady with curiously small eyes and a curiously large nose. "Is she not beautiful?" asked the Grand Choo-Choo, bowing his head. "Beautiful, beautiful," gulped the Scarecrow. He thought of lovely little Ozma and dear little Dorothy, and all at once felt terribly upset and homesick. He had no recollection of the Silver Island, or his life here whatever. Who he was, anyway, the Scarecrow of Oz or the Emperor of Chang-Wang-Woe. He couldn't be both. "Ah," whispered the Grand Choo-Choo, seeing his agitation. "You remember her." The Scarecrow shook his head with an inward shudder. "Now show me myself, Choo," he asked curiously. Pulling the cord of a portrait beside the Empress, Choo-Choo revealed the picture of Chang-Wang-Woe as he had been 50 years ago. His face was bland and jolly, and to be perfectly truthful, quite like that the Scarecrow's in shape and expression. "I am beside myself," murmured the Scarecrow dazedly, which in truth he was. "You are a very royal and handsome person," stammered the Grand Choo-Choo. The Scarecrow, stepping off the throne to examine himself more closely, dropped the little fan and parasol. He had not really had time to examine them, since they snapped off the beanstalk, and now, looking at them carefully, he found them extremely pretty. "Dorothy will like these," thought the Scarecrow, slipping them into a large side pocket of his robe. Already in the back of his head was a queer little notion that he would at some time or other return to Oz. He started to give the Grand Choo-Choo a spirited description of that wonderful country, but the ancient gentleman yawned, and waving his hands toward the door, interrupted him with, "Would not your Supreme Highness care to inspect your present dominions?" "I suppose I may as well." With a deep sigh, the Scarecrow took the Grand Choo-Choo's arm, and holding up his royal kimono, which was rather long, with the other hand, walked unsteadily down the great salon. They were about to pass into the garden when a little fat silverman slid around the door, a huge silver drumstick upraised in his right hand, with a great drum hung about his neck. The drummer beamed on the Scarecrow. "Chang-Wang-Woe the beautiful has come. Sublime and silver Scarecrow, let sound the royal drum," chanted the little man in a high, thin voice, and started to bring the drumstick down upon the head of his noisy instrument. "No, you don't!" cried the Scarecrow, leaping forward and catching his arm. "I positively forbid it." "Then I shall have no work!" screamed the drummer, falling on his face. "Ah, gracious master, don't you remember me?" "Yes," said the Scarecrow kindly. "Who are you?" "Oh, you don't remember little Happy Toko?" wheezed the little man, the tears rolling down his cheeks. "I was only a boy, but you used to be fond of me. "Why, of course, my dear Tappy," said the Scarecrow, not liking to hurt the little fellow's feelings. "But why do you beat the drum?" "It is customary to sound the drum at the approach of your royal highness," put the Grand Choo-Choo importantly. "Was customary," said the Scarecrow firmly. "My dear Tappy-Oko, it never sounded in my presence again. It is too upsetting." Which was true enough, for one blow of the drum sent the Scarecrow flying into the air. "You're dismissed, Happy," snapped the Grand Choo-Choo. At this, the little Silver Islander began weeping and roaring with distress. "Stop! What else can you do besides beat a drum?" asked the Scarecrow kindly. "I can sing, stand on my head, and tell jokes," sniffed Happy Toko, shuffling from one foot to the other. "Very good," said the Scarecrow. "You are henceforth Imperial Punster to my person. Come along, we're going to look over the island." The Grand Choo-Choo frowned so terribly that Happy Toko's news shook with terror. "It is not fitting for a slave to accompany the Grand Choo-Choo and the Emperor," he hissed angrily. The Scarecrow looked surprised, for the Kingdom of Oz is quite democratic, and no one is considered better than another. But seeing this was not the time to argue, he winked broadly behind the Grand Choo-Choo's back. "I'll see you again, Tappy, my boy," he called genially, and passed out into the garden, where a magnificent silver palanquin, surrounded by pikemen and shield-bearers, awaited him. Chapter 8. The Scarecrow Studies the Silver Island. 2 days had passed since the Scarecrow had fallen into his kingdom. He was not finding his royal duties as pleasant as he had anticipated. The country was beautiful enough, but being Emperor of the Silver Islands was not the simple affair that ruling Oz had been. The pigtail on the back of his hat was terribly distracting, and he was always tripping over his kimono, to which he could not seem to accustom himself. His subjects were extremely quarrelsome, always putting one another's cues or stealing fruit, umbrellas, and silver polish. His ministers, the Grand Choo-Choo, the Chief Chow-Chow, and General Mugwump, were no better, and keeping peace in the palace took all the Scarecrow's cleverness. In the daytime, he tried culprits in the royal court, interviewed his 17 secretaries, rode out in a royal palanquin, and made speeches to visiting princes. At night, he sat in the great silver salon, and by the light of the lanterns studied the book of ceremonies. His etiquette, the Grand Choo-Choo informed him, was shocking. He was always doing something wrong, dodging the imperial umbrella, speaking kindly to a palace servant, or walking unattended in the gardens. The royal palace itself was richly furnished, and the Scarecrow had more than 500 robes of state. The gardens, with their sparkling waterfalls, glowing orange trees, silver temples, towers, and bridges, were too lovely for words. Poppies, roses, lotus, and other lilies perfumed the air, and at night 1,000 silver lanterns turned them to a veritable fairyland. The grass and trees were green, as in other lands, but the sky was always full of tiny silver clouds. The waters surrounding the island were of a lovely liquid silver, and as all the houses and towers were of this gleaming metal, the effect was bewildering and beautiful. But the Silver Islanders themselves were too stupid to appreciate this beauty. "And what use is it all, when I have no one to enjoy it with me?" sighed the Scarecrow, "and no time to play." In Oz, no one thought it queer if Ozma, the little queen, jumped rope with Dorothy or Betsy Bobbin, or had a quiet game of croquet with the palace cook. But here, alas, everything was different. If the Scarecrow so much as ventured a game of ball with the gardener's boy, the whole court was thrown into an uproar. At first, the Scarecrow tried to please everybody, but, finding that nothing pleased the people in the palace, he decided to please himself. "I don't care a kinkajou if I'm the Emperor. I'm going to walk I'm going to walk and to talk to whom I please," he exclaimed on the second night, and shaking his glove at a bronze statue, he threw the book of ceremonies into the fountain. The next morning, therefore, he ascended the throne with great firmness. Immediately the courtiers prostrated themselves, and the Scarecrow's arms and legs blew about idly. "Stand up at once," puffed the Scarecrow, when he had regained his balance. "You are giving me nervous prostration. Chew, kindly issue an edict forbidding prostrations. Anyone caught bowing in my presence again shall lose—" The courtiers all looked alarmed. "His pigtail," finished the Scarecrow. "And now, Chew, you will take my place, please. I am going for a walk with Tappy Oko." The Grand Choo-Choo's mouth fell open with surprise, but seeing the Scarecrow's determined expression, he dared not disobey, and he immediately began making strange marks on a long red parchment. Happy Toko, it trembled as the Scarecrow Emperor took his arm, and the courtiers stared at one another in dismay as the two walked quietly out into the garden. Nothing happened, however, and Tappy, regaining his composure, took out a little silver flute and started a lively tune. "I had to take measures into my own hands, Tappy," said the Scarecrow, listening to the music with a pleased expression. "Your Majesty used to be very fond of this song," spluttered Happy. "It is difficult to talk while upside down, and if you don't think so, try it." "Ah," said the Scarecrow, beginning to feel more cheerful. "Tell me something about myself and my family, Tappy Oko." "Happy Toko, if it pleases you, your supreme amiability," corrected the little silver man, somersaulting to a standstill beside the Scarecrow. "It does and it doesn't," murmured the Scarecrow. "There is something about you that reminds me of pudding, and you tapped the drum, didn't you? I believe I shall call you Tappy Oko, if you don't mind." The Scarecrow seated himself on a silver bench, and motioned for the Imperial Punster to sit down beside him. Tappy Oko sat down fearfully, first making sure that he was not observed. "Saving your Imperial presence, this is not permitted," said Tappy uneasily. "Never mind about my Imperial presence," chuckled the Scarecrow. "Tell me about my Imperial past." "Ah," said Tappy Oko, rolling up his eyes. "You were one of the most magnificent and magnanimous of monarchs." "Was I?" asked the Scarecrow in a pleased voice. "You distributed rice among the poor and advice among the rich, and fought many glorious battles," continued the little man. "I composed a little song about you. Perhaps you would care to hear it." The Scarecrow nodded, and Tappy, throwing his head back, chanted with a will: "Chang Wang Wo did draw the bow, at twist the queues of 1,000 foe." "In Oz," murmured the Scarecrow reflectively, as Tappy finished, "I twisted the necks of a flock of wild crows. That was before I had my excellent brains, too. Oh, but I'm a fighting man, there's no doubt about it. But tell me, Tappy, where did I meet my wife?" "In the water," chuckled Tappy Oko, screwing up his eyes. "Never!" The Scarecrow looked out over the harbor and then down at his lumpy figure. "Your Majesty forgets. You were then a man like me, not stuffed with straw, I mean," exclaimed Happy, looking embarrassed. "She was fishing," continued the little punster, "when a huge silver fish became entangled in her line. She stood up, the fish gave a mighty leap and pulled her out of the boat. Your Majesty, having seen the whole affair from the bank, plunged bravely into the water, and swimming out to rescue her, freed the fish, and in due time made her your bride. I've made a song about that also." "Let's hear it," said the Scarecrow, and this is what Happy sung. "Sing, sing, a silver fisher's daughter was fishing in the silver water. The moon shone on her silver hair, and there were fishes everywhere. Then came a mighty silver fish, seized her line, and with a swish of silver fins upset her boat. Sing, sing, could neither swim nor float. She raised her silver voice in fear, and who her call of help should hear but Chang Wang Wo, their emperor, who saved and married her, what's more. Did I really? Asked the Scarecrow, feeling quite flattered by Happy's song. Yes, said Happy positively, and invited me to the wedding, though I was only a small boy. Was Choo-Choo there? The Scarecrow couldn't help wondering how the old nobleman had taken his marriage to a poor fisherman's daughter. Happy chuckled at the memory. He had a princess all picked out for you, he confided merrily. And there he stood in awful pride and scorned the father of the bride. Ho ho! Roared the Scarecrow, falling off the bench. That's the Oziest thing I've heard since I landed in the Silver Islands. Tappy, my boy, I believe we are going to be friends. But let's forget the past and think of the present. The Scarecrow embraced his Imperial Punster on the spot. Let's find something jolly to do, he suggested. Would your extreme highness care for kites? Asked Happy. 'Tis a favorite sport here. Would I? But wait, I will disguise myself. Hiding his royal hat under the bench, he put on Happy Toko's broad-rimmed peasant hat. It turned down all round and almost hid his face. Then he turned his robe inside out and declared himself ready. They passed through a small silver town before they reached the field where the kites were to be flown, and the Scarecrow was delighted with its picturesque and quaint appearance. The streets were narrow and full of queer shops. Silver lanterns and little pennants hung from each door. The merchants and maidens in their gay sedans and the people afoot made a bright and lively picture. If I could just live here instead of in the palace, mused the Scarecrow, pausing before a modest rice shop. It is dangerous to stop in the narrow streets, and Happy jerked his master aside just in time to prevent him being trodden by a huge camel. It sniffed at the Scarecrow suspiciously, and they were forced to flatten themselves against a wall to let it pass. Happy anxiously hurried the Emperor through the town, and they soon arrived at the kite-flying field. A great throng had gathered to watch the exhibition. There were more kites than one would see in a lifetime here. Huge fish, silver paper dragons, birds, every sort and shape of kite was tugging at its strings, and hundreds of Silver Islanders, boys, girls, and grown-ups, were looking on. How interesting, said the Scarecrow, fascinated by a huge dragon that floated just over his head. I wish Dorothy could see this. I do indeed. But the dragon kite seemed almost alive, and horrors! Just then it swooped down, a hook in the tail, caught the Scarecrow's collar, and before Happy Toko could even wink, the Emperor of the Silver Islands was sailing toward the clouds. The Scarecrow, as you know, weighs almost nothing, and the people shouted with glee, for they thought him a dummy man and part of the performance. But Happy Toko ran after the kite as fast as his fat little legs would carry him. Alas, alas, I shall lose my position, wailed Happy Toko, quite convinced that the Scarecrow would be dashed to pieces on the rocks. Oh, putty head that I am, to set myself against the Grand Choo-Choo. The Scarecrow, however, after recovering from the first shock, began to enjoy himself. Holding fast to the dragon's tail, he looked down with great interest upon his dominions. Rocks, mountains, tall silver pagodas, drooping willow trees flashed beneath him. Truly a beautiful island. His gaze strayed over the silver waters surrounding the island, and he was astonished to see a great fleet sailing into the harbor. A great fleet of singular vessels with silken sails. What's this? Thought the Scarecrow. But just then the dragon kite became suddenly possessed. It jerked him up, it jerked him down, and shook him this way and that. His hat flew off, his arms and legs whirled wildly, and pieces of straw began to float downward. Then the hook ripped and tore through his coat, and making a terrible slit in his back, came out. Down, down, down flashed the Scarecrow and landed in a heap on the rocks. Poor Happy Toko rushed toward him with streaming eyes. "O radiant and immortal Scarecrowcus, what have they done to you?" he moaned, dropping on his knees beside the flimsy shape of the Emperor. "Nearly knocked out my horrible stuffing," mumbled the Scarecrow. "Now, Tappy, my dear fellow, will you just turn me over? There's a rock in my eye that keeps me from thinking." Happy Toko, at the sound of a voice from the rumpled heap of clothing, gave a great leap. "Is there any straw about?" asked the Scarecrow anxiously. "Why don't you turn me over?" "It's his ghost," moaned Happy Toko. And then, because he dared not disobey a royal ghost, he turned the Scarecrow over with trembling hands. "Don't be alarmed," said the Scarecrow, smiling reassuringly. "I am not breakable like you meat people. A little straw will make me as good as new. A little straw, do you hear?" For Happy's pigtail was still on end, and he was shaking, so that his silver shoes clattered on the rocks. "I commanded you to fetch straw," cried the Scarecrow at last, in an angry voice. Happy dashed away. When he returned with an armful of straw, the Scarecrow managed to convince him that he was quite alive. "It is impossible to kill a person from Oz," he explained proudly, "and that is why my present figure is so much more satisfactory than yours. I do not have to eat or sleep and can always be repaired. Have you some safety pins?" Happy produced several, and under the Scarecrow's directions, stuffed out his chest and pinned up his rents. "Let us return," said the Scarecrow. "I've had enough pleasure for one day, and can't you sing something, Tappy?" Running and fright had somewhat affected Happy's voice, but he squeaked out a funny little song, and the two, keeping time to the tune, came without further mishap to the Imperial Gardens. Happy had just set the royal hat upon the Scarecrow's head and brushed off his robes when a company of courtiers dashed out the palace door and came running toward them. "Great cornstarch!" exclaimed the Scarecrow, sitting heavily down on the silver bench. "What's the matter now? Here's all the pigheads on the island, and look how old Choo-Choo is puffing." "One would expect a Choo-Choo to puff," observed Happy slyly. "One would," but he got no further, for the whole company was upon them. "Save us!" cried the Grand Choo-Choo, flinging himself at the Scarecrow's feet. "Save us! Save us!" wailed the courtiers, forgetting the royal edict and falling on their faces. "What from?" asked the Scarecrow, holding fast to the silver bench. The king of the Golden Islands!" shrieked the Grand Choo-Choo. "Ah, yes," murmured the Scarecrow, frowning thoughtfully. "Was that his fleet coming into the harbor?" The Grand Choo-Choo jumped up in astonishment. "How could your Highness see the fleet from here?" he stuttered. "Not from here, there," said the Scarecrow, pointing upward and winking at Happy Toko. "My Highness goes very high, you see." "Your Majesty does not seem to realize the seriousness of the matter," choked the Grand Choo-Choo, wringing his hands. "He will set fire to the island and make us all slaves." At this, the courtiers began banging their heads distractedly on the grass. "Set fire to the island!" exclaimed the Scarecrow, jumping to his feet. "Then peace to my ashes! Tappy, will you see that they are sent back to Oz?" "Save us! Save us!" screamed the frightened Silverman. "The prophecy of the beanstalk has promised that you would save us. You are the Emperor Chang Wang Woe," persisted the Grand Choo-Choo, waving his long arms. "Woe is me," murmured the Scarecrow, clasping his yellow gloves. "But let me think." That's where we're going to end our reading today. Come back tomorrow to find out what happens with the Scarecrow and the rest of our friends. So I hope you have a good day until tomorrow when we read another 2 chapters.